I want to thank you all so much for coming today. And we're so excited to have Lisa Keefauver here to present to us. Lisa is a nationally known grief and empathy expert, and she runs deep in terms of her wisdom in this area, both from personal and a professional experiences. So we're really excited. She has a podcast she's going to tell you about. Her business is thriving. And just today, we learned that she's going to be joining us as a field faculty. I'm sorry, a field supervisor. So any students that are out there that are interested in a really great field placement, you'll find Lisa's agency on the list. Reimagining Grief is the name of her company. And Lisa, we're so excited to have you here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody. I wish I didn't have to share the slides so that I could have the screen open so I could see all of your amazing faces. But thanks, everybody, so much for joining me. And Jennifer, thank you to you and the folks at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work for having me today for this Impact Hour. I really appreciate it. So as Jennifer mentioned, my work is in, let's see, let me just make sure I can get my slides going there. My work is in grief and empathy, and this is my passion. I'm that weird person in your life who gets excited when people ask you what you do, and I said, I talk about grief for a living. So that's what we're going to spend this next 45 minutes doing. And we're going to start a little bit just grounding with who I am and why I am that person who loves to talk about grief. We're going to talk a little bit about the way I'm trying to expand our understanding of grief from, in my opinion, a pretty limited view of grief, which I think is harmful to us as individuals, but also impacts the systems and policies that happen as a result of our limited understanding of grief. I'm going to talk a little bit, or a lot of it, about our grief education and miseducation. And I don't mean just our education as social workers. I know many folks joining us today are BSWs and MSWs, but I mean our education in terms of how our culture teaches us about grief and the positives and negatives that we learn. I'm going to explore a little bit about grief support and why good grief support, in my opinion, starts long before you show up for somebody. And it's about doing your own grief work. And then just finally kind of close with my tried and true motto about grief support, which is show up, shut up, and listen, and keep showing up. So that's what we're going to cover today. Jennifer, you'll let me know if I'm going too fast or if folks have questions, but I know we'll have time to talk at the end of the presentation today to discuss anything you guys want to learn more about. So why me? Why reimagining grief? It took me a while to think about what formula I wanted to put together to explain why I'm the person that I am doing the work that I am. And though I didn't become a social worker until I was around 30, I think I always knew I was going to be in this profession. I studied at the University of Vermont School of Social Work. And there I became really passionate about a sort of postmodern approach, a narrative therapy approach to understanding systems and individuals and problems and problem stories. And so I spent a good part of my career in lots of different settings, not related to grief, but as I've come to understand now in my life and the work that I do, that much of what I was seeing was actually grief, which is going to our expanded conversation. I was the clinical director of a large family services organization that did refugee resettlement and older adult services, crisis intervention programs. I worked in foster care and adoption. I worked as running public housing systems and programs. And through all of the work that I did in those years as a therapist, as a clinical director, as a practitioner, as a case manager, when I look back at that work, much of what I was seeing presented by my clients in the work was actually grief, often disenfranchised grief, or experiences that were not named grief, and therefore their behavior, their emotions, their physical symptomatology, everything was being pathologized. And oftentimes recognizing that maybe the interventions that we were offering didn't actually address some of the root issues that folks were facing. Being a helper is one thing, except for when the world reminds you that 100% of us need help sometimes. And in 2011, when I was the clinical director of a large family services organization, my husband died in my arms. I was 40, he was just 44, our daughter was 7, along a misdiagnosis ending in a very quick death. And my world shook, needless to say. And one of the things I started to recognize was that though I had many supportive friends and family members, even my social work workplace didn't really know how to show up and support me in my grief, didn't understand what grief looked like or felt like. And even my friends who were very well-meaning and offered lots of support, in case any of them ever tune into this, I'm going to tell you, you guys did a great job. And I started to recognize the ways in which our grief culture was really problematic. I moved to Austin and founded a nonprofit program for those of you tuning in from Austin called the Care Box Program, delivering care supplies to cancer patients. And through that work, of course, I saw many families going through grief and recognizing again the ways in which families and systems weren't supporting folks in grief. And then my very good friend died here in Austin, also by my side. And though I did some other work as the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Mission Capital, about a year and a half ago, I recognized that I needed to take this lifetime of professional experiences in the space, my personal experiences of grief and loss, my passion for storytelling and speaking and writing, and my real commitment to holding true space and bearing witness and create it into something that was going to change the narratives of grief. And that's what I did. I founded Reimagining Grief, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. And I decided to learn how to create, launch, host, and produce my own podcast, which I did last year. And the podcast is called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. As I said, my mission is changing the narratives of grief. And we're going to talk in a little bit about why I'm so passionate about that and why I use the word narrative, because I think how we talk about things, of course, many of you know as social workers, shape how we experience things. And they also shape the policies and the systems and practices that we put in place. So I created this organization, this company, to be able to do that in lots of different settings and formats and reach different audiences and reach people where they're at. I offer grief guide services via Zoom like this. I offer workshops and groups sort of to the community. One of the other things that I saw a real deep need for, which we can talk about later, but won't be in today's presentation, is a need for organizational understanding of grief and loss, particularly in the corporate settings, but I would also say even in institutions like universities, hospital systems, currently talking with the Livestrong Cancer Institutes about some programming, and thinking about how are we teaching leaders, companies, and organizations to create the systems and policies and capacities to support employees through grief. As a writer and somebody who knows words matter, I was tired of the empathy cards out there being very problematic and harmful often in their language. So I launched a line of empathy cards. As I mentioned, I host a podcast. I actually have a UT School of Social Work alum as a guest on my podcast, Rachel Carnahan-Metzger. I don't know if she tuned in today, but she was on my show last season and will be again this season. And then I do a lot of writing and speaking on the topic, again, just trying to bust the silo that we have about not talking about hard things, as our famous Brene Brown's social worker talks about often. So that's the work that I'm doing. That's what I'm passionate about, and we can talk a little bit about that in our Q&A. But I want to start first by exploring and expanding really our understanding of grief. If this was a live workshop, I'd be pulling people to ask what you think about how you would begin to define grief. But since we can, I want to tell you about this analogy or metaphor that I've come up with that I use that I think is really useful when thinking about how we learn and talk and support our own grief and the grief of others. As storing creatures, as we are as human beings, our identities, our lives are built by the stories that we tell of our lives. We have a million different experiences every moment of every day, and none of those experiences have meaning until we apply a story to them. And we tell those stories not only of our own lives, but of other people's lives, and also of future lives, our future selves. And so a death or traumatic event or some other kind of loss, which we're going to talk about today because grief is not just related to death, but some kind of traumatic event or triggering event is akin to the manuscript of our lives being torn to shreds and handed back to us with no instructions on how to rewrite or live our lives. And so when we think about grief as not just being related to death or having some technical definition, when we think about it as the complete disruption of our operating system, if you want to use sort of a technical metaphor, that's really the state in which our bodies, our minds, our psychology, our financial situation, everything is in. We have a torn manuscript. We don't know our character's motivation. We don't know the plot. Our setting has changed. Everything about our orientation has been disrupted. As I mentioned, and since I'm talking mostly to social workers, hopefully you all already agree and know this, and many of you are probably also experts in the field, but I want to remind us and ground us that grief is a normal response to loss. And while we give a lot of lip service to that, I would say generally in the social work profession, but also in this country, our policies and practices and personal behaviors don't really attend to that. It's part of my mission to disrupt that. But grief is a response to loss, which means it's not just a response to death of a person or a pet. It can be a response to a dissolution of a relationship, for example, for a divorce or a breakup, or maybe family members who have decided to disappear from one another or cut off communications. It absolutely results from chronic or terminal illnesses, anticipatory grief, of course, many of us are familiar with, but also the grief that comes when you have a chronic condition that maybe limits your capacities. And again, back to that analogy, when you can't live into the story you've been telling about yourself and your identity, there's grief there. We grieve when there's a sort of a finite reason that the future is no longer available. Many women in particular who find out that they aren't able to give birth to children, face grief experiences. I would argue that we're experiencing grief in the state of our global pandemic right now with the uncertain futures and abilities. It results from trauma and catastrophic injury. I had a guest on my show last season who was hit by a car and became paraplegic, and he talked about the grief he went through coming to terms with this new version of his life. We can have grief around immigration and migration when we lose track of our culture and our community. Certainly, and I know many people in the country, maybe even in our virtual room today, are experiencing grief around job loss or career transitions. I would add, which isn't on the slide, that we can also experience grief not just by things that happen to us, like me with the death of my husband and later my friend, and actually this summer my dog, but we can have grief over things we choose. So even when we choose to switch careers or move to a new country, for example, or end a relationship and start a new relationship, grief is valid then too. Part of my mission isn't just to help us expand the way we think about grief in terms of being beyond death or loss. I'm also inviting us all to think about broadening our conception of grief as being more than sad. Again, I know I'm talking to a room full of social workers, so hopefully you all are already on that page, but in my experience, when I'm talking with individual clients, friends, peers, even organizations, people often limit grief to just feelings. And in particular, they like to limit grief to feelings of sadness. So one of the things I like to do I use this little sort of flower graphic here, is to help us think about the sort of 365 or more holistic way that we really need to think about grief, both for our own healing and our own grief journeys, but also so that we're better able to show up in support of them as social workers, or if we're in the position to create policies or practices in our companies and organizations, we can understand the ways in which grief shows up. We all think about grief and the feeling. I put in that corner there, all the feels, feel all the feels. And one of the most misunderstood feelings of grief is actually anger. I think we often think of sadness and despair and sorrow. And I'd like to draw people's attention to anger, particularly folks working in the medical profession who often see patients and patient families presenting angry as disgruntled patients, but often what we're actually observing is grief. But if we kind of take the whole flower in its, you know, the entire flower of grief, we need to think about all of these other aspects of grief that is impacted. Certainly cognitive functioning is impacted tremendously. Many of you have probably heard of the expression of grief brain or brain fog. And this lasts longer than a day or a week. Sometimes for some people, they aren't really restored for much longer, sometimes over a year. We also live grief in our bodies, in our embodied practice, because of course, as you guys know, again, I'm preaching to the choir here in the social work room, hopefully, but we don't live in our heads disconnected from our bodies and our nervous systems. Everything is connected. And so our bodies live and experience grief, both sometimes in the physical way, just from lack of touch from a partner or peer, if that's who we lost, or a child, but also in the ways in which our nervous systems, blood pressure, etc., react. So we might be facing ourselves or be noticing in our clients or patients numbness and tingling and dizziness and aches and pains, etc., sleeplessness, oversleeping, undersleeping, etc. Of course, it disrupts our spiritual existential sense of ourselves. It can disrupt our financial selves if the person was a breadwinner, for instance, or change the trajectory of our financial stability. One of the biggest areas I think we don't think about the impact of grief, of course, is in relationships, not just with the relationship of the person that we might have lost, but in the secondary losses that often come as a result of grief. Sometimes because people aren't equipped to show up for us in our grief and loss, they can't handle bearing witness to our pain. Sometimes because the only reason we were connected to that person was because they were connected by our shared person. There's lots of reasons that it happens, but it often means that we have all these cascading secondary losses. And then I really have been thinking more and more lately about the relationship between grief and stress, and wanting to talk with you a little bit about that, which of course is part of why we're seeing the embodiment of grief that happens so often. Let me get my screen back together. So many of you, of course, probably know the sort of neurobiology of our stress response, but one of the reasons I want to couch stress and grief in this context, in this conversation, is back to that analogy I gave you. So if we think about the ways in which we operate as humans as having stories, particularly humans in the 21st century, where we don't have to necessarily worry about fending off saber-toothed tigers or where our next meal comes from. We live in a very imagined story life. We have predictability, we have the illusion, frankly, of certainty, of planning. And when this event happens in our lives, this loss that happens, we're operating without a story. So that's resulting in all of these cascading and compounding changes, which I just talked about minutes ago, maybe loss of friendship, financial, job, you may have to move homes. Some of these things are things that happen to me. It also means we're constantly in a state of adaptation and learning and unlearning, because our identities are shifting. We're having to learn new roles. I, for instance, had to learn how to become a single mother overnight, as an example. We're also being flooded with all kinds of new emotions that, frankly, many of us have never had to process before. And as we'll talk about later, we don't really do emotions well, just writ large here in our country, in our culture. We're shifting our relationship dynamics. We're shifting the rules and guidelines that we have in our lives no longer apply. And while all of that is happening, we're all experiencing very often this pressure to be normal. I think many of us have heard this in the wake of the pandemic, of sort of getting back to normal and going to our normal routine. And so there's a real cognitive dissonance between what we're experiencing, all this flood of sort of neurochemicals and thoughts and emotions in our body, with what the world is expecting of us. And that sort of cognitive dissonance is adding to the kind of stress response that many of us are experiencing in the wake of grief. And that's even if we're even naming it as grief. So one of the things that we're going to do next is sort of talk about thinking about the importance of naming grief and how that helps us navigate. So I think I shared before, but I want to take a moment to share right now. 100. This is one thing we share. We're all born and we all die. And that's about it. And hopefully we all vote. Sorry, that was my civics duty plug there for today. Those of us who are eligible. But 100% of us experience grief. And actually 100% of us, like most of us, will experience grief many times in our lives. Sometimes the grief is compounding. Sometimes it's over time, but we will all be experiencing it. And I've been hearing us talk sort of in community lately about the collective grief that we're all facing in the wake of the pandemic, for instance, and in the wake of the national reckoning on race that we're experiencing here in the US. And while I agree that we are all experiencing some level of grief, I want to remind us that while it's a shared human experience, each of us experiences grief uniquely. And not only do we experience it differently for ourselves, so the way I grieve my friend Joe was different than the way I grieve my husband, which is different than the way I grieve my dog, which is different than the way I'm grieving life in the pandemic. We also grieve differently than one another. So even within family systems, people grieve differently. And we're going to talk about different grief styles in a little bit. But more importantly, what I'm thinking about as we're in this time of the pandemic and this recognition that we all are coming from different social locations is that we're all in the same ocean, but we're in different boats. That's one way to think about this grief. And I know you've heard that expression before, but I think it's particularly true when we think about grief and our experiences of grief. We all have different coping strategies and resources, whether that's from our family systems, our financial availability to cope. It could be our racial, social, gender, sexual identity, and our position in our family systems, in our cultures, in our communities. And it's impacted by our personal and cultural history too. So even we're going to talk next about where we learn grief. So how I grieve is very informed by the way my family modeled grief and by the way I was modeled grief as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual woman who's grieving my married husband. And all of those differences result in different styles of grief. And that's really important for us to remember, because when we show up with our own style of grief, assuming that everybody else should be grieving that same way, we can cause a lot of harm, both for ourselves and for the people that we're trying to support. So now we're going to get into one of my favorite topics. This is, the grief geek is coming out right now, y'all. But it's really about our grief. I call it miseducation, because I would say largely I think we're miseducated on grief, but I do think there is some positive grief education out there too. But I really want to make visible what it is we're learning, because I think so many of us never even thought about learning grief. And that's really important for us to become aware of what we learn, and so we can examine if what we learned is serving us or hurting us, and then what choices we have to make to navigate going forward. And I'm speaking to all of you today, both as individuals. You all are individuals who are grieving or have grieved or will grieve. But I'm also reminding you that all of this learning that I'm offering today is also with your social worker hat in mind. So whether you're simply working in macro spaces but supervising employees or colleagues, or are collegial with other folks, or whether you're serving clients or patients or customers, however you talk about the people that you serve and collaborate with, this information is really important for them as well. So the foundations of our grief miseducation are really kind of, I've broken them down for simplicity's sake into 4 layers. We learn grief and what grief is about, of course, for any kind of spiritual, religious background or community that we're raised in or that we choose to participate in as adults. We learn it around from our communities and neighborhoods. And the other thing that doesn't say there is sort of any kind of subculture, culture, communities. Could be Southern, you know, someone from the South, or I grew up in the Midwest. How do we think about grief in sort of the Midwest culture? We absolutely, which we're going to unpack a little bit, learn grief in our families. And that is especially true even when no one has ever mentioned the word grief in your family growing up. Because we learn, of course, as you know, both implicitly and explicitly. And sometimes the damaging miseducation we get is from our implicit learning. And then more broadly, I would say our poor grief culture here in the US, in case anybody's joining us from somewhere else, is particularly problematic. And I've made the choice to use those words. Our US culture is built in a white supremacist and capitalist culture. And as we're going to explore when we look a little bit at our US culture, many of the ethos and ways of thinking that have really constituted US culture are really problematic when we think about showing up for ourselves and for others in their grief. So we were talking a little bit, I mentioned that we are sort of in this US culture, which I'm very clearly naming as white supremacist capitalist culture. That's sort of how this culture was created and cultivated and maintained. And some of the ethos that we sort of take as truths or truisms here in the US and have largely thought about as being particularly good and positive and helpful in lots of ways, I want to invite us to think and explore a little bit in ways, how might they be problematic in lots of domains, of course, but today I'm going to talk to you about how they might be problematic when we're thinking about the context of grief and loss. Not in any particular order, and I could have made the list a lot longer, but I didn't want to drain your eyes on the screen. I think we could start for sure with individualism. This US culture of individualism, which has this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, which is a myth, frankly, because white Americans didn't pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But this myth, this ethos that we live by is particularly problematic, again, when you think about grief, because what it tells you is you should just be able to suck it up and do it on your own and figure it out, even though the manuscript of your life has been shredded and there's no instructions on how to rewrite. Somehow you just need to figure it out. We also have our capitalist sort of underpinnings of our culture is very productivity obsessed. And so what happens in the unnecessary harm of grief is that we should on ourselves and others should on us, including our systems and institutions, that we somehow need to hurry back to some level of productivity in the before. And that there's an unspoken rule or timeline that we need to get back there. And I would say, actually, it's not unspoken. The average workplace, if you're lucky enough to get leave, has a 3-day leave policy. I couldn't even plan my husband's memorial in 3 days. I did end up getting a root canal between his death and the memorial, but I didn't get to plan the memorial in 3 days. And that's because, and I was allowed time off because my relationship with my husband was recognized. So when we think about the ways in which systems and institutions and the productivity harm us, it's even more harmful to people who are already disenfranchised. Some other things that I think are particularly important for us to think about when we think about the influence of US culture on our own grief culture and experience is our belief that everything is fixable. Okay, we have a real pathologizing way of thinking about the world. And I don't just say that in the social work context, but I think that's largely true of US culture. There's a problem, it needs fixing. This is problematic because, of course, then it makes us think that it makes us pathologize grief when grief, as we talked about before, is a normal response to loss. What it also does, which we'll talk about later when we talk about grief support, is put the burden on all of us to think that we, when we show up for someone in their grief support, have to come with a solution. And that it's our jobs to fix their pain. And that, again, causes a lot of unnecessary harm. We have lots of other ethos. Again, I could do an entire probably presentation on US culture and grief, but I won't. Always being happy, emotions belonging in private. We have a top 10 list in Buzz Newsfeed quiz for everything, including grief. It's really problematic. We also put other people's comfort before our own. That's a sort of cultural belief. And that's very problematic when we're thinking about our own grief and healing journey. So our families grow up in this, our families here in the US grow up in this larger institution of US culture, right? But we are very influenced by our families, whether it's our family of origin, our chosen families in our life. But when I'm thinking particularly about the early developmental years in our families, we learn very much about what grief is and isn't, and it informs how we feel we should or shouldn't be grieving throughout the rest of our lives, or how others should or shouldn't be grieving. So this series of 4 questions, we're not doing an in-person, this isn't therapy today, or we're not doing a session, but I use these 4 questions actually to open up every single episode of my podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. I'm generally interviewing people who are talking about a particular death or grief loss or other kind of loss. Sometimes I interview experts, but even the experts, I invite them to think about these questions. What is your earliest memory of grief in your growing up life? And how were the adults in your life modeling grief? Again, implicitly or explicitly. So if no one ever talked about it, but people passed away, divorces happened, and nobody ever said anything, that's saying something. What were people emotional or not emotional? Were they angry or not angry? Did they bring the memory forward of the person who was passed away, or did they put away all the photos and hide it away? What did that look like in our growing up life? And I invite my guests and the folks that I work with individually and in groups to think about, what did that learning teach you about what grief should or shouldn't look like? And we're going to talk a little bit later about the shoulds of grief. But I think it's particularly important for us to be reflective. This isn't an invitation to blame our parents, by the way. Some people have gotten on me like, well, our parents were just doing the best they could. They are, and I'm doing the best I can as a parent, and I hope that my daughter will do better. But that's the point. If we don't examine what we're learning, we're going to keep carrying forward these practices that harm the next generation. So I invite people to think, what was helpful about what you learned? What was not helpful about what you learned? How did that learning serve you, positively, negatively, or both, in the season of your grief or this most recent grief experience? So I really want to just reiterate to you, not today in this talk, but as you move forward, hopefully before you have your next grief experience, to really sit down and answer these questions for yourselves. Maybe even have this conversation with your partner, with your parents, with your children, to be thinking about that and thinking about how you actually want to believe and practice in the wake of grief. So I just want to make sure I did not skip a slide. I did not, so we're good to go. So this is also another presentation I could do all on its own, which is the myths of grief and our grief beliefs. Myths, as you know, can serve us. They can pique our curiosity, but they can also be really harmful to us in every domain of our life, but in particular in the domain of grief and loss and grieving and healing, our healing journey. And they trigger the shoulds of grief. So one of the things I often do when I'm working with individuals is invite them to listen out for the shoulds that are happening in their mind when they are struggling with their grief. Whether it's the shoulds that they're hearing themselves say to themselves, I should be over it by now, I should be better, I shouldn't be so sad, I shouldn't be so angry, I shouldn't be so happy, I shouldn't be so joyful, okay? But I also invite people to think about, where are they hearing those shoulds? Is it from their employers, their friends, their peers? Where are they hearing about this? And what is that teaching them? I think one of the biggest myths, and I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did not intend the 5 stages of grief to actually be that way, but I do think that regardless of what her intentions were, we've all taken on this belief that there are 5 stages, that grief is linear, and that it's neat, and it goes in an upward trajectory, and it has an ending. And it's I could, again, do an entire talk on that, about why it's extraordinarily problematic. But even when we try to ditch that myth, as I invite people to do, it seeps into every way we think about things, again, our institutions and our practices. One of the myths is, anytime you see someone grieving after a year, it's somehow pathological, that their grief is complicated. And though I know there are specific and unique circumstances where grief can be complicated, particularly as it relates to traumatic death or loss, I think we overly pathologize grief. Again, connected to that first myth, which is there's stages, you get to it, and somehow magically at the year mark, or maybe 2 years if you're generous, you're going to be done. that grief is sad only then makes us all feel really weird and uncomfortable when we're feeling angry or relieved, by the way, or hopeless or hopeful. Any of the feelings that we feel that aren't sadness. There's a myth that we have this idea that there's just one way to grieve. And again, that allows us to should on ourselves or should on other people if we're not doing it right. There's lots of different styles of grief, whether you're sort of an intuitive griever, or if you are somebody who is more an active griever, etc. The myth that grief is visible is problematic too. So when we see someone happy and joyful or at an outing or a gathering, then we think, oh, good, they're over it. They've moved on, right? But grief is not always visible. Again, it's not just emotions, it's physical, financial, and all of these things. But we make the mistake when we think that our grief or others' grief is always visible. A big one I hear often, both in folks who've lost partners, but I also know this through the work I've done with folks who've lost young children, which is people believe that when a new relationship starts, that you've moved on. So I've often had guests talk about, and people that I work with, when they had a next child or next baby, then people saying to them, oh, well, some version of it, you must be okay now, or it all must be okay now. The first time I ever got into a dating relationship, I even remember my father, I'm going to throw him under the bus, he didn't know any better, he's learning too, said to me, oh, good, you're moving on. The goal of moving on, that's a myth right there. Our goal of grief is not to move on, it's to integrate grief into our lives and to integrate and to shift the relationship we had with that loss. And back to where we talked about those cultural myths, which is grief is a problem that needs fixing. You'll hear me, if you follow me on Instagram, listen to my podcast, my writings, do work with me. You'll hear me say this over and over again because I think it's that important. Grief is not a problem and it doesn't need fixing. And all we do when we show up trying to fix people's grief is make them feel further isolated and alone and pathologized, and they're less likely to reach out to you for help in the future. So this is, again, if it was a workshop, we'd be doing a little homework and little activities, but we're not doing that today. We're just a talk. But people always, one of the biggest questions I get is, well, how do I show up for somebody in their grief? I just want to know what to say, and I want to know what to do. And I just want to show up. And first of all, I'm going to say, I don't get it right sometimes too. So pressure's off for you. But I would say that grief support actually starts long before we ever show up for somebody else. And it starts with us doing our own grief work. Some people talk about grief as a journey. I had a guest on last season who gave me this expression. I've used it ever since. I love it, which is the work of grief. And we have to understand and come to terms with our own grief myths that we've bought into and our own grief style and start to understand them ourselves before we show up in the world. Because if we don't do this grief work, which I'll go over, we end up in ways, I don't know what the word is, contaminating other people or sort of bringing our problematic thinking and harming other people. Of course, unintentionally, when our goal was to show up and support, we often if we don't do our own grief work, we often end up causing harm. So how can we spend time examining our own grief myths? When you think about that list that I shared earlier, which one of those do you buy into when you really think about your own experience of grief? What is your style? Are you an intuitive griever that you're comfortable with your emotions? Are you more of a doer, getter done, practical problem solver griever? What's your style? Another one, which is again a whole topic on its own, is just, even though emotions are only one part of grief, they're a really big one, and they're often a hurdle for us showing up for other people. When we can't get comfortable sitting and bearing witness to our own pain, to our own despair, to our own heartache, to our own anger, our own sadness, then we are much less capable of showing up with empathy to somebody else and to being able to bear witness to them. So we need to get better practiced at showing up for our own emotions. I wrote a poem recently this year and I gave a little video talk about it. And I say we need to invite our emotions over, like visitors over for a cup of coffee, not permanent house guests. I think many of us treat our emotions as those family members were going to come unpack their bags in the guest room and never leave, and they're not. So part of the work of grief is getting to know in touch with our own emotions. It's also seeking our own support. I hope all of you who are in school and those of you who are practitioners know self-care and getting your own support is incredibly important, particularly as we work with clients. But getting to process your own grief is important before we show up for other people. When we're about to show up for other people, whether it's virtually in the day of COVID, where we're showing up on Zoom or in postcards or letters or texts or phone calls, we need to check our grief beliefs at the door. So any grief beliefs we have are ours, and we need to make sure that we're not contaminating folks with our beliefs and that's causing harm. We need to do the best we can based on our relationship with that person to understand their grieving style. You might be an intuitive emotional griever and they might be a practical griever. Then make sure you know that when you show up for them, or vice versa. I think the other thing, when we loop back to the conversation we had earlier about the stress response in our body, is we need to soothe our nervous system before we show up for somebody in their grief. Even, I would say, before you write a letter, but certainly if you're going to get on video or see somebody in person or be on the phone, how can you soothe your own nervous system? Because if you are stressed, if you are anxious, if you are worried about saying or not saying the right thing, your energy carries. And the last thing a grieving person needs is to have your energy contaminating theirs. So then what does grief support look and feel like? Again, if this was a workshop, I'd be doing an invitation to ask you to think about when you look back to a time when someone showed up for you in a really dark time, when they really showed up for you in a way that was meaningful. What did it look and feel like? Maybe after today's talk, give this a consideration. But my guess is your answer is it's not going to be a grand gesture. They didn't say a word or a phrase that completely erased your pain. It was probably very subtle. They probably showed up very authentically and empathetically, not with sympathy or pity, but real compassion. That person probably showed up for you in relationship with you as opposed to instructive or instructional. They probably talked a lot less than they normally do, and they probably listened a lot more. I would say talk less, listen more reminds me of a Hamilton song there. They probably spent their time acknowledging and affirming you, not correcting you. So again, in social work world, we think about those mirroring practices. They probably didn't tell you a platitude or a silver lining. And please, I have an entire line of empathy cards, some of which were created because of all the horrible platitudes and silver linings people said to me. And they were probably awkward, and hopefully you didn't notice it or you didn't care. But I do want to warn us, it's probably going to feel awkward. It's going to feel awkward, and too bad. You have to show up anyway. And as my guest on my most recent episode said, Amber Smets, you just have to sit in the suck with us. Just have to sit in the suck, and it's going to be awkward, and it's okay. For those of us who like to be practical and instructional and helpful, practical support is huge. Show up, bring a meal. Don't ask a griever what they need. They don't know what they need. They're in a brain fog. If their kids go to school with your kids, just say, hey, I'll drive them. If you know they shop at the same grocery store you shop at, say, hey, I'm going to pick you up a load while I'm there. Do something practical. But grief support probably looks like a lot less than what you think it needs to look like. And if we can drop that fix-it mentality, it's going to make us a lot better equipped to show up. As we close, I wanted to kind of attend to because I get this every time. Okay, but Lisa, what do I say? I know there isn't one right thing to say, but I just need to know what to say. And the truth is, it depends on the relationship. It depends on the loss. It depends on the timing, whether it's a week ago this thing happened or a year or 5 years later, it depends. But here's some general themes or sentiments I want to invite you to think about. However you're feeling is okay. One of the biggest problems I've encountered for grievers is the guilt they feel for feeling feelings they feel they shouldn't feel. So just affirming to the person, however you're feeling is okay. Another thing or a sentiment you might say is, because overwhelm is another thing, you don't have to know how to do it all. You'll find your way and I'll be here. You can also see, but this is not just a plug for my show, but I think it's true. I know grief can be so sneaky, but I've got your back. I'm going to be here. Don't ever tell a griever you're so strong, I don't know how you do it. One of my least favorite expressions in the world. So instead say, I hate that you have to be strong right now. And I'm here to support you and maybe to carry a little bit of the burden with you for a while. And as you figured out, since the name of my podcast is Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, you can also just say there's nothing I can say except, and then put in your favorite or their favorite swear word, if it's appropriate for the relationship you have with them. The key really is keep showing up. That's really the key.